Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Assistant Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds Seminar Series. For this seminar series, you can submit questions during the webinar by typing in the chat box. We will open the floor to questions at the end of the webinar. Now I will introduce today's speaker, Dr. Robert Silverman. Dr. Robert Silverman is a professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at the University at Buffalo, the State University of New York. He's a affiliate research associate at Buffalo Center for Social Research and a senior research associate at the Center for Urban Studies. Dr. Silverman received his PhD in urban studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, his master's degree in public administration, and his bachelor's degree in political science from Arizona State University. Before joining the faculty at University at Buffalo, he was a faculty member in the sociology department at Wayne State University and the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Jackson State University. His research and teaching focus on fair and affordable housing, neighborhood planning, and community development. He has published scholarly articles on these topics in top journals, such as the Urban Geography, Housing Policy Debate, and Journal of Urban Affairs, Urban Studies, and others. His research has been funded by Poverty and Race Research Action Council, Ralph C. Wilson Foundation, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, American Sociological Association, Buffalo Municipal Housing Authority, Urban County Consortium, State of New York, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It's very excited to welcome Dr. Robert Silverman.
Well, great. Well, thanks for that introduction. It's really, a pleasure to be here today. I wanted to, spend a little bit of time talking about a current research project that I've been involved with that looks at small area fair market rents and the small area fair market rent rule that HUD adopted in 2016 and started implementing in 2018, a couple of years later. And so I'm going to talk about, some recent research that I was doing related to that project. And the other thing I just wanted to acknowledge before I got started was that this particular project is something that I've been doing in collaboration with another faculty member at the University of Buffalo, Professor Kelly Patterson in the School of Social Work. And the specific project I'll be talking about in a few minutes after I give some background was also supported with a small grant from the Baldy Center for Law and Social Policy at the University of Buffalo. So what I wanted to talk about today is some research that I've been working on really for a few years now, looking at the small area fair market rent rule, which is a change in how rent subsidies are calculated in the United States for portable housing vouchers that are issued by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And then those vouchers are distributed by local public housing authorities. And, the idea of a small area fair market rent is something that was introduced with the small area fair market rent rule in 2016, where HUD mandated that 24 metropolitan areas, and you can kind of see them on the map adjacent to the text in this slide, were required to switch from using average rents in the metropolitan area as a baseline for setting their subsidies to using what they call small area fair market rents, which are really based on average rents in zip code areas. And so the idea was to kind of make rents more reflective of rents in a smaller geography, so that, you know, households would have resources where they have more housing choices available to them. And so I'll give some more background about you know, that policy and how it was rolled out in a couple of minutes, but then I'll move on to a discussion of some interviews that we did last year in the 4th year of implementation of the small area fair market rent rule with public housing authority administrators in some of the metropolitan areas where small area fair market rents were mandated. And in the course of doing that research, we interviewed 10 PHA administrators in 8 of the metropolitan areas. And what we found in that research was that, you know, although there was a policy in place to encourage moves to what are referred to as opportunity neighborhoods by HUD, which in essence are higher rent areas where you might find a better mix of high-performing schools, job opportunities, access to transportation, and other resources for households, that in fact, the outcome of the implementation of that policy has really been slow to materialize. In other words, even though the policy was in place, opportunity moves weren't really happening at the pace that people would anticipate. And in part, that was because there was a limited supply of affordable housing in those opportunity areas, as well as limited resources to kind of support the policies and programs that HUD put in place to make those types of moves occur. And that outcome is something that's pretty well documented in the literature. But we also were finding from talking to public housing authority administrators that there was a dissonance between how HUD constructed and envisioned the policy and how PhD administrators were actually kind of understanding what an opportunity move was and even defining those moves and the areas that they might take place in. And so I'll go through some more detailed information about what we were finding from the research and then offer some recommendations that policymakers should consider moving forward with this particular initiative. But before I kind of get into that specific research project, I'll provide a little more background on what the goals of the small area fair market rent rule were when it was adopted in 2016, and then when it began to be implemented in 2018. And there are really, you know, 2 goals. They're both interrelated behind small area fair market rents. One is the primary goal, which is to increase housing choice voucher holders' access to high opportunity areas. And it's pursued by, you know, essentially, you know, increasing the subsidies, which are called payment standards by housing choice voucher agencies in zip codes where small area fair market rents are higher than average rents in a metropolitan area. And so the idea behind this is that by giving, you know, higher rent subsidies or higher payment standards in these areas, households will then be able to afford to make moves to opportunity areas when they identify housing in them. And what we were finding in our early research is that in the initial implementation of this policy, that goal wasn't fully achieved. And in fact, new payment standards, just offering, you know, higher subsidies didn't fully address both the rent gap and also other obstacles that people were encountering when they were trying to make opportunity moves. And the second goal of the small area fair market rent rule, again, it's directly related to the first in the sense that HUD also was encouraging public housing authorities to find cost savings when they administered their housing choice voucher program in order to, you know, create the resources pool necessary to increase payment standards in high rent areas. And the way that was achieved was by lowering payment standards in zip codes where average rents were less than metropolitan-wide fair market rents. And again, this particular goal wasn't fully achieved either in the early implementation of the small area fair market rents rule, mainly because HUD required PHAs to hold existing tenants harmless so that those decreases in subsidies wouldn't impact tenants who already had leases and were, in contracts, under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, but also because public housing authorities were reluctant to reduce payment standards in those lower rent areas because they were concerned about backlash from landlords who saw the rent subsidies they were receiving declining simply because they were located in lower income communities. And so they became accustomed to receiving a certain level of subsidy, and there was concern if they had less of a subsidy available to them that they might not participate in the program in the future. And so those two goals are really important to keep in mind because they kind of informed early research that we did on small area fair market rents. And so one of the baseline studies that myself and Professor Patterson conducted took place during the first year of implementation of the small area fair market rents rule. And so after 2018, in 2019, we collected data on what the payment standards were, what the subsidy levels were that local housing authorities were offering in all of the 24 metropolitan areas that were required under the small area fair market rents rule to actually, apply this standard to setting those subsidies. And what we were trying to understand if payment standards actually demonstrated fidelity to the goals of the small area fair market rent rule. And there was a pretty simple formula that we used to make that determination. What we understood was that under the small area fair market rule, PHAs had some discretion in how they set payment standards. They could be between 90 and 110% of the average rents at the zip code level of what the published small area fair market rents were. And so we theorized that if there was high fidelity to the small area fair market rents rule, we would observe that PHAs would set their payment standards closer to 110% of small area fair market rents in zip codes that were identified as opportunity areas. And in those lower opportunity areas, they would set their payment standards closer to 90%. And so the way that looked was it simply that if we observed a high degree of fidelity, we would see a tendency towards a relatively lower subsidy in low rent zip codes and a relatively higher subsidy within that range allowed by HUD in high rent zip codes. And so we'd expect kind of a 90 to 110% distribution between low and high rent zip codes. If there was moderate fidelity to the goals of the small area fair market rent rule, then we would expect parity between the two types of geographies. Low rent areas and high rent areas would both be somewhere around, the average rent that was reported at the zip code level. And then if there was low fidelity, we would see kind of an inverted relationship between small area fair market rents and the income or the rent levels in high and low rent zip codes. And so we were collecting data on the payment standards that were being set by local housing authorities, looking for what types of outcomes and relationships existed between the opportunity status of a zip code. So when we collected our data in this initial pilot study, we looked at the 172 public housing authorities that were in those 24 metropolitan areas. And we were able to identify data from 48% of the housing authorities that actually published their data and made it available publicly. That sounds like, just a fraction of the housing authorities. But when we actually looked at how many vouchers were actually issued across all of the housing authorities, what we were able to, identify actually were payment standards for 79% of all of the vouchers that were distributed in those 24 metropolitan areas. Because, across the metropolitan areas, there were a number of public housing authorities, but there tended to be, some very large housing authorities that held the majority of the vouchers. And then there were some smaller municipalities that had their own way of administering of the vouchers that might not have reported as consistently. And so we still had a sizable number of all the vouchers that were identified within our sample. And then finally, just, to get a sense of how many zip codes and how many possible payment standards could have been set across all of the metropolitan areas, there were over 3,800 zip codes in those 24 metropolitan areas. And we were able to identify payment standards for most of those zip codes, at least for some of the housing authorities that were actively kind of implementing the housing choice voucher program in those metropolitan areas. So what we found in that pilot study in the aggregate was that, on average, payment standards that were set under the small area fair market rent rule seem to conform with average rents at the zip code level. And that's what that first line in this table shows, that all payment standards were around 100% of small area fair market rents. But when we compared low opportunity zip codes to high opportunity zip codes, in other words, low rent to high rent zones.
Robert, it seems you're unmute yourself currently.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, well, what I was saying before I clicked my slide is that what the aggregate was showing is that there was a slight disincentive to locate in high opportunity areas overall. But then when I moved to the next slide, I was just pointing out that there is some variation across metropolitan areas in the US in terms of how payment standards were being set. And so in one area like Dallas, for instance, what you could see is that, actually payment standards were slightly above average rents in high and low opportunity areas. And in part, that's kind of an outcome of, the housing market in Dallas, which was seeing rents go up pretty steadily during the time that small area fair market rents were being adopted. But also there's an additional situation in Dallas where they had a little more experience working with small area fair market rents because they were under a court order since 2014 to use small area fair market rents because of past housing inequities in that metropolitan area. And so Dallas had a little bit more background in using smaller fair market rents. They had kind of gone through the learning curve somewhat and got to a point where there was at least some parity in terms of how they were setting rents, but still the kind of cost savings that were expected from the second goal of the small area fair market rents rule in terms of lowering payment standards in low opportunity areas weren't really coming to fruition. Although you can see across the first table in this slide that there were still slightly higher payment standards in a relative sense in high opportunity areas. And so Dallas was kind of performing better than a lot of metropolitan areas in terms of the small area fair market rents rule, partly because of that longer exposure to this particular policy. But then when you look at other places like Jacksonville, Florida, you see a very clear inversion in terms of how payment standards are being set. And that was more the trend in a lot of the metropolitan areas when they started using the small area fair market rent program. Although they had increased their payment standards in general, they still were relatively lower in high opportunity areas. And so there were some disincentives to make opportunity moves that were, impacting the degree to which the program was able to accomplish its goals. And that led us to ask some questions about why that inversion was there and what was happening at the local level that might be impeding progress on encouraging opportunity moves across the country in these metropolitan areas. Which kind of brings me to the study that I was going to focus on for the rest of the talk today. And that is a study where my colleague and I did qualitative research where we contacted public housing authority administrators to interview them about their experience implementing the small area fair market rents rule. And this was after they had had several years of experience running the program. And so we did that study a year ago and in the fourth year of their implementation. And so the methods we used were pretty straightforward. We conducted semi-structured interviews, and we solicited interviews from all the PHA administrators or the public housing authorities that administered 1,000 or more vouchers in those metropolitan areas. And so there were 172 PHAs in those 24 metropolitan areas that were mandated to use small area fair market rents. But of those 172 PHAs, 68 administered 1,000 or more vouchers. And so these were the relatively larger PHAs that had larger caseloads to at least draw some feedback from about their experiences with the program. And so we did semi-structured interviews with those PHAs. And once we would identify a housing authority that agreed to be interviewed in a metropolitan area, then we went on to try to recruit another PHA in one of the other metropolitan areas that had not responded yet. And after canvassing all of the PHAs and contacting them for interviews, we ended up getting 8 PHAs in 8 different metropolitan areas to agree to interviews. And we actually interviewed 10 different administrators across those 8 PHAs. And we did those interviews on Zoom, and we analyzed the data with a qualitative data analysis software package. And so what you can see in the table is simply a summary of who we interviewed. There were 5 women and 5 men that we interviewed. There were 3 African-American administrators and 7 white administrators. And geographically, we were able to have PHAs represented from at least one of the 4 major regions where the policy was being implemented. In terms of findings from our research, what we were finding, first of all, was that opportunity moves remained relatively unchanged after the rule was adopted due to issues related to urban form, the structure of rental markets, and program resources. And so there were a number of structural barriers, many of which have been identified in past literature looking at mobility and opportunity moves with housing vouchers that were also identified in this research. And they included things like barriers linked to neighborhood amenities and social institutions, which kind of subdivided into a number of areas. There were transportation barriers, barriers people encountered because of lost social ties and institutional ties that they might value in the neighborhoods that they lived in, and also concerns about racial isolation if people pursued an opportunity move. In other words, moving from a racially diverse area or an area where an individual's race was not in the minority to a predominantly white community. Now, in addition to those types of structural barriers, there were also barriers that impeded opportunity moves because the payment standards that were being offered to tenants were not keeping pace with rising rents. And in the contemporary kind of framework, concerns about rent increases or the actual reality of rent increases were a constant kind of obstacle to identifying opportunities for moves. And then there were also barriers in opportunity areas simply because not just the cost of housing, but the actual availability of rental units was limited. And so opportunity moves many times didn't happen simply because people couldn't find units to actually rent. So some of the things that the Public Housing Authority administrators were telling us in the interviews included, some excerpts that I've added here. When people were talking about those amenities and the social institutions that they were interested in sustaining with moves, we would get comments like this from our administrators. One administrator said, when it comes to employment and it comes to getting to your job and being able to get around and the expense of cars and insurance and all of that sort of stuff, most folks have chosen to remain in lower rent neighborhoods. And so transportation obstacles and other barriers to kind of maintaining your connection to existing employment and existing institutional activities was an important consideration that dissuaded some from pursuing opportunity moves. Another, type of, comment related to other social networks. And so voucher holders often chose to remain in lower rent neighborhoods, partly because, as people told us, their mother is around the corner and their church is down the street, and it's familiar. And so that familiarity with the places where people in the end chose to remain or chose to live was another factor that reduced the probability of an opportunity move. And then another PHA administrator, talked about resources for the programs themselves. And this person said there's a lot of factors that just factored into why folks may or may not have participated in a mobility program. It wasn't just as simple as, they've got a great opportunity to be in a new school system. It's really depends on, I think there's a demographic to that too. And so, what was coming out early in the interviews was that in addition to structural barriers in terms of the built environment and in terms of institutions in different neighborhood settings, there were also structural barriers related to race that resulted in people being dissuaded from making opportunity moves. There were also other things that people told us related to these types of barriers to moves that related to the supply of units and the underfunding of programs. One housing authority administrator said that, this new world has affected both rents and payment standards in the most unbelievable ways, as far as, and far more than small area fair market rents can assist us with right now. Rents have exploded here. We've actually even had to ask for a waiver to exceed the payment standards and go up to 120%. And so even within that range of payment standards that the small area fair market rent rule allowed public housing authorities to operate within, they were still not able to keep pace with rising rents. And they still had to, apply for exception payment standards, which was an additional administrative process that people had to be involved in. And another housing administrator, kind of, summed it up very, kind of concisely by saying, zip codes have higher rent zip codes have very, very, very few rental units, period. So even if the payment standard could be calibrated with rents, the availability of units was still problematic. And then one PHA administrator explained that his agency tried to address this gap by putting its own upward mobility program in place. And when describing it, he emphasized that we put it in place, but again, HUD doesn't really pay for it. So even though the small area fair market rent rule created a mandate to encourage opportunity moves, a lot of the supportive programs and other types of wraparound services that were needed to actually make those moves possible weren't necessarily part of the policy. And so individual housing authorities had to find their own internal resources to make up that difference. So that kind of leads to the second major takeaway from our qualitative research. And in our study, one of the things that we started to hear from PHA administrators was that they were perceiving opportunity moves differently than the way HUD had defined this particular type of moving, and also the way it had been kind of written into the policy framework itself. And so we found that in our research that opportunity moves remained relatively unchanged after the small area fair market rents rule because of dissonance between HUD and PHA administrators around those definitions and approaches to implementing the program. And so first of all, there was agreement in principle about opportunity moves, but there was divergence in how to implement the program when it actually was put in place on the ground. We also were finding that the structural barriers that I talked about related to takeaway one also led to more incremental implementation by PHA administrators. And so those resource constraints and other structural barriers meant that the administrators took a different approach when they tried to implement the program. Another thing that came up in the interviews was that the PHAs themselves were more intentional than HUD about targeting families for opportunity moves. When HUD kind of designed the small area fair market rents rule, it seemed to apply in a blanket fashion to all types of households, seniors, the disabled, families, and single households. But the PHAs kind of picked up the program and started to apply it more specifically by targeting families. And then finally, in our interviews, we were finding that the administrators had a lot of concerns about how the degree to which HUD factored in race in terms of planning for the implementation of the program, or simply didn't factor race in at all in their way the program was designed. So in terms of some examples of what the administrators were telling us, and when we looked at things like the divergence of principles and practice, this first quote is pretty representative of how the administrators received the program. One of the public housing administrators told us, I was very happy to see this mandate come. I know it was a controversy for the Trump administration, but we got it. Thank God it's the law. And so the administrators were not resistant to the idea of promoting opportunity moves. It's something that they were, very supportive of and even advocated for. But then we got other perspectives, like the second quote, where one of the administrators told us that, I just want to be clear, philosophically, conceptually, policy-wise, we support the goals of small area fair market rents, but like many federal rules and regulations, they get lost in transition. In terms of the real world impact in our jurisdiction, in our voucher program, if you look at the top quintile of zip codes, we already had all, at that time, when small area fair market rents were required, about 12% to 15% of our vouchers under lease in the top quintile of zip codes. So yeah, you could argue it's not entirely representative, but it's reasonable. I think that's sort of reasonable, statistical percentage or vouchers in the most affluent communities. And so what this administrator was saying was that they supported the idea of small area fair market rents and promoting opportunity moves, but they were already kind of doing this before HUD mandated it. And at the level that they were doing it, they felt that they were accomplishing the goals of the small area fair market rents program. Whether they needed to ramp up their activities or not was kind of a second consideration. Another really interesting, kind of thing came out when we were talking to the public housing administrators as well, which had to do with, their approach to actually implementing the program. And this is a slightly longer quote, but it really captures the whole idea of how there was a divergence in terms of principles and practice, in terms of actual implementation on the ground. And so what this public housing administrator told us is, I've counseled staff to encourage new participants to come in the program to plan for second moves. The voucher holders' mindset is that they waited too long to get assistance. And the mindset is, now I have assistance, I can move now, which ties into the small area fair market rents concept. I now can go somewhere that I really want to. But what we find, this is the PHA administrator speaking, is a success rate in leasing is what we're counseling people to do right now. Once you're on the program, if you take too long to find housing, you lose your opportunity, and you've waited years for assistance. Oftentimes the participant has in their mind to make an opportunity move. And then they're in this panic of, oh no, you can't terminate my voucher. And then the administrator went on to say, I have to get this voucher leased up. This mindset is to increase our PHA's leasing success so that we've got to spend things down. Nobody wants their funds recaptured. And the strategy is to get people to lease in place first. Just lease so that you can get in an apartment right now. We lease you, even if you hate your apartment, you're done. You are at least have assistance. Now you can take time. You can even ask us 6 months down the road to grant permission to move outside of our rules. And so what this administrator was communicating was that because of many of the barriers to opportunity moves, that they were, prompting tenants to simply lease in the apartment that they had at the time, and then to plan for an opportunity move sometime in the future in order to kind of protect their voucher, which is very different than what the intentions of the small area fair market rent rule were when it was adopted. Another thing, like I was saying, that came out of this set of interviews was that the housing authorities were very intentionally focusing on families in terms of promoting opportunity moves, which again was a much more focused approach than what the actual rule required that HUD was promulgating. And so one public housing authority administrator told us that my overarching goal with the program was to give kids, families, a chance to break the cycle of poverty. So that's when why we're targeting differently. We went after the households that had children in them. We were doing our briefings. We point out the benefits of that. I think that's the future of this program, is to target families. And then another, voucher administrator also pointed out, we do targeted outreach to families with children, and then we have specific mobility briefings for those families. And so again, what came up in the interviews very clearly was that housing authorities understood the value of opportunity moves, and they really prioritized families for those moves because they felt that in large part, access to higher quality schools for households with children was one of the most tangible benefits that opportunity moves might bring. But that goal and that approach was also in conflict with a number of issues that housing authorities perceived tenants confronting related to race. And they were critical of the actual small area fair market rents rule and some of the ideas or underpinnings behind it. And one of the housing authority administrators even commented that the construction of the policy was nested in a sort of perspective of white privilege. And so this person was really kind of saying that the people who designed the small area fair market rents rule weren't necessarily attuned to all the nuances and dynamics of race that take place in and across urban neighborhoods. And this meant that the program itself was not a good fit for the communities that it was aiming to deliver benefits to. And another PHA administrator made this comment related to, mobility opportunities and how it might impact families with that primary benefit in terms of access to higher performing schools that those families were trying to tap into by making opportunity moves. And so what this administrator said is that the vast majority of high performing school districts are very high performing. They're almost all white, 90% plus, 95% plus in some cases. He said that a voucher holder family with kids who happen to be of color might move to that jurisdiction and their kids don't have a good experience in the schools. There's an enormous racial achievement gap across all of these school districts. They felt more comfortable, which is always sort of hard to quantify and measure in the school district that they left, because there was an African-American principal, there were Latino teachers, there were African-American teachers, and there were kids of color in the classroom. And so even every kid wasn't the only kid, the only Black kid, or the only Latino kid in a class. And education folks tell you there's all kinds of impacts for all of that, microaggressions and everything else. And in some ways, many of these families have not wanted to move. And so even where opportunities for opportunity moves presented themselves to households, and where families were receiving additional counseling or additional information to make moves, there were still, barriers related to race, both in terms of perceptions of the communities people would move to and the actual experience that the children might have in the classroom, which was seen to be one of the main benefits of opportunity moves that worked against people's willingness to make those moves. So there are some kind of conclusions and recommendations that grow out of this research. First of all, in terms of takeaway one, we again concluded that opportunity moves remained relatively unchanged after the rule was adopted due to issues related to urban form and the structure of rental markets and program resources. So first, there's a need for additional ancillary programs to address things like transportation barriers. So if opportunity moves were also subsidized with allowances for transportation assistance, that might help to overcome that particular barrier. There's also a need to update small area fair market rents more frequently, so payment standards can keep pace with rising rents. And so in the spring, when the small area fair market rents are published by HUD, those rents are somewhat reflective of average rents at the zip code level, but over the course of a year, as rents increase, there's a need to continue to update those rent studies and then the payment standards that are based on them in order to make rents affordable and continue to be reflective of what existing housing conditions are. And then, of course, there's a need to coordinate the SAMFR rule with other HUD programs designed to increase the supply of affordable housing. So if affordable housing construction is targeted in what are identified as opportunity areas in those higher rent zip codes, then the supply of housing issue could also be addressed more adequately. Then in terms of takeaway number two, again, we were concluding that opportunity moves remained relatively unchanged after the small area fair market rent rule was adopted because of dissonance between HUD and PHA administrators. And so there is a need for HUD to, first of all, extend the time frame for housing searches and increase resources for things like mobility counseling, where voucher holders are planning opportunity moves. And there's also a need for more explicit targeting of resources for opportunity moves, as well as additional wraparound services for households with children, because HUD needs to kind of catch up with what's happening on the ground in that respect. And finally, there was a need to broaden the definition of opportunity moves, factoring in how the racial composition of voucher holders and social institutions influences what actual tenants perceive as an opportunity move. And also, to make those types of definitional changes in a manner that provides local PHAs with more flexibility when identifying opportunity areas and identifying program resources. So that is kind of in a nutshell, a summary of the research. I tried to leave some time for discussion. And so I'm going to close my slides and go back to the whole group now. There's how.
Thank Professor Silverman giving this great talk to compare different actually cities. They have these housing choice venture programs to provide opportunity moves. So, and also some takeaways. So currently we just open to the questions. So my first question is, I feel it's very interesting. You mentioned that there is kind of a conflict in between the target families and also actually deal with the race. I'm wondering, like for these small area fair market rents, these programs, how different compared to the FMRs and the metropolitan wide needs programs in terms of their racial composition? Did they target in different? Did they have different like racial composition for these two different programs? Yeah. Can you hear me, or it seems you are frozen? Is just me here so frozen, or seem frozen, or anyone else is also?
I think he's frozen.
Oh, okay. Yeah, me too. It seems it dropped probably. We just to see, wait to see if it will back.
Are you still there?
Yeah, we are still here.
My internet went down like right at the tail end of your question. So
Oh, that's
just came
fine.
back up. It's like, this is reminiscent of like the deep part of COVID. I haven't had internet problems for so long. And then all of a sudden, it's
That's
crazy.
fine. Yeah. So I just wondering, like this small area fair market rent program compared to the FMRs
Mhm.
for the metropolitan wide programs. Since you mentioned have this divergence between the principle and also implementation. So I wonder what's the difference for the ratio composition for these two different programs.
Well, the FMRs are really just the average rents in the entire metropolitan area. So they would be the averages across all zip codes. And so, when you're looking at individual zip code level data, obviously there are some zip codes where average rents are lower than others. And those also, from other research that I've done, tend to, be areas where, income levels are lower. There's higher, concentrations of non-white populations. And so you have, more segregated cities, have the lower small area fair market rent zip codes that also share some of those demographic features. They're more minority concentrated, lower income. And so, what the small area fair market rent captures is both, the differences in rent levels across zip codes, but also it kind of picks up all those demographic characteristics that coincide with, kind of lower income, lower rent neighborhoods. And so the idea is that if you just used average rents for an entire metropolitan area, that, you start to make it more difficult to set the subsidies in a way that there'd be a large enough subsidy for somebody to afford some of the highest rent, which also tend to be, some of also the more predominantly white communities in a metropolitan area, where other resources like, concentrations of employment, higher, performing schools and other kind of amenities might be present. And so the smaller fair market rents allow PHAs to set their subsidies based on that smaller geography. And so the subsidy in a high rent area is going to be higher than another zip code where rents might be moderate or low. And the subsidies will just be more reflective of rents. But under the old approach, where they used the average rents, once the rent exceeds the average, then the subsidy couldn't increase at all. It would just remain at that level. So there'd be a tendency to over subsidize low rent neighborhoods and under subsidized high rent neighborhoods, which led to more concentration of housing in poor communities.
I see. So, which means that needs a small area of fair market rents. The program is more minority oriented.
Well, it's focused on making subsidies match up with more localized rents in a way that it opens opportunities for moving to a broader geography.
I see. So the other question is your interviews selected is from different regions, and you're showing actually is two regions, but actually in your interview you introduce is from all of the countries. So for these different regions has different numbers is because is in terms of the map you are showing, actually is proportion for that distribution for the geographic distribution, because I noticed that just seems for this program for its mainly focus on the coast areas. So for the Middle West is only, I think it's only 2 or 3 states. it's covered. So I'm
Right.
wondering, yeah. So I'm wondering, what's the reasons behind this kind of spatial distribution, or and also for your interviews, like select the administrators for different regions is based on is proportionally related to this spatial distribution.
Yeah, I was just pulling up my slides again. Oh, well, I don't have the screen, but anyhow, yeah, the first part of your question is, how did HUD settle on, those metropolitan areas essentially? And, I don't know the exact formula that HUD used, but they tried to get some kind of regional distribution. Obviously, when you look at, kind of subsidized housing programs, they tend to be clustered, in larger metropolitan areas. And they also, are where those population centers are. And so the Eastern Seaboard, has a lot more of the population. And so when you kind of look at the map, which I don't have sharing privilege anymore, but, there's obviously the Eastern Seaboard, which has a lot of states which were selected. And then there's California, which, had, I think 3 metropolitan areas in the state of California that were part of those mandatory areas. And California represents a significant population in the US. And there were some Texas cities. And then, like you were saying, in the Midwest, you had Illinois and Indiana. And I believe that were the 2 Midwestern cities that were kind of counted in that region. And so what HUD did is they were trying to get some type of a geographic distribution of the first wave of metropolitan areas that were selected. There was also, kind of, lobbying from some states not to be included in that first wave. There were some PHAs and large metropolitan areas that didn't want to be selected. And a good example is New York City. There are no New York State PHAs or metropolitan areas in that initial wave of smaller area fair market rent rules mandated areas. And in California, Los Angeles is a notable absent metropolitan area, even though when HUD did their kind of demonstration program for small area for fair market rents, they actually had Long Beach, which is part of the LA metropolitan area, as one of those demonstration cities. And so, there's kind of an administrative kind of process that HUD followed, but there was also some political lobbying that took place to kind of come up with that final list of initial metropolitan areas. So that's I guess the first part of your question. The other one is, how did we select housing authorities to include in our study? Well, we wanted to start with the larger housing authorities, the ones that kind of administered the most vouchers, because they tend to have more capacity, larger staff. They kind of, in many cases are kind of the housing authorities in a metropolitan area that, provide kind of the footprint for other housing authorities to follow in terms of setting up their small area fair market rent programs. In a lot of cases, some of the smaller PHAs will just replicate the payment standards that are created by the larger ones, just to a certain degree. And so we used 1,000 vouchers as the cutoff, because when you start to administer that many vouchers, it's kind of an indication of a certain level of organizational capacity to run the programs. Now, one thing that I didn't really talk about in the presentation is that in a lot of the metropolitan areas that were selected for smaller fair market rents, some of the larger housing authorities in those metro areas were actually exempt from the rule, because they were in another HUD demonstration program called the Moving to Work program, which had a similar goal, but a very different kind of approach to actually achieving opportunity moves. And so, for instance, the Chicago Housing Authority is exempt from the smaller area fair market rents rule because they're an MTW program. The Philadelphia Housing Authority is like that. Charlotte, North Carolina, Atlanta, Georgia. I'm trying to remember San Diego Housing Commission in California, and Washington, D.C.'s Housing Authority, and a number of other ones. And so there were some of the larger housing authorities that administer the most vouchers in some of the more minority concentrated areas. Sometimes we're not even part of this mandate. And that's an issue that HUD will confront down the road. And so once we kind of, identified the housing authorities with 1,000 or more vouchers that were actually in the program, then we started contacting them. And once we got an interview with a local housing authority in one metropolitan area, then we tried to get ones in some of the other metropolitan areas and tried to achieve some type of geographic representation across the metropolitan areas in that manner.
I see. That makes sense. And also, it's very interesting you mentioned actually for the other programs, the Move for Work is also use the different approaches. So I'm wondering, when you say different approaches, it means like it's more like a supply provide, because for this program is more like a attendant assistant program. For that is more like the project, the housing program. So which means it's related to like your takeaway. One of your takeaway actually is limited supply of housing. So would that is different approaches from the housing supply side. So will be kind of these two programs kind of can be like a complement each other, or it's what's the kind of like association like between them? So can you?
Right. Well, the small area fair market rent rule really applies to portable housing vouchers. So that's when people get a voucher to go out and search for a market rate apartment, in the housing market. Now, and it doesn't address the supply side of the problem. In some cases, there are programs like the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which provides money to state housing authorities to build affordable housing. And there are other kind of, programs of that nature that increase the actual supply of affordable housing. And the siting of those properties, whether they're sited in, what are already lower income areas or higher income communities, can be one additional, effort to, increase the number of units available in places where, other amenities might be present, whether they're close to job centers, close to major, kind of public transit corridors, where, school performance levels are higher so that residents have access to, better public education options. And so that piece of the puzzle still needs to be better kind of coordinated with, some of these efforts to promote mobility, because just providing people with a larger subsidy doesn't necessarily connect them with housing if there's a shortage of housing in those neighborhoods. With the other program, though, like the Move to Work program, it operates under a very different logic. It kind of came out of reforms to, HUD's policies that were adopted in, I want to say 2014, during a period when the House of Representatives was under Republican control. And it was really focused on deregulation. And the idea was that if housing authorities that participated in the MTW program, were in that program, then they would be allowed to be much more flexible in how they ran their small area fair market rents program, under the concept that they would find cost savings to then, put more money into things like mobility counseling. And so whether or not that came to fruition is still unknown, because there hasn't been a lot of evaluation of that program. But what started out as a program that really only applied to about 30 public housing authorities around the country, that program has actually grown. I think there's over 200 now. and it's one of the fastest growing demonstration programs in HUD. And so it kind of operates in parallel to small area fair market rents. You might have a metropolitan area, and there's lots of them actually, but like Pittsburgh, where the Pittsburgh Housing Authority is an MTW, and they've kind of come up with their own maps of what they consider to be opportunity neighborhoods. They have mobility counseling programs that they run with funds that they get from their housing choice voucher program. And they also have, modified their actual subsidies in ways that are, similar to what small area fair market rents do, but with different maps. I think they use census tracts instead of zip codes. And then the next housing authority adjacent to them, which is their county housing authority. And the name of the county is escaping me right now, but so the city of Pittsburgh's housing authority, operates that way. And then their county housing authority uses small area fair market rents to kind of achieve the same goal. And sometimes they try to collaborate, and other times they kind of do things differently. And that's kind of been repeated in the Chicago metropolitan area, where the Cook County Housing Authority is operating under small area fair market rents, as well as most of the other authorities in that metro area. But the Chicago Housing Authority is an MTW. And so there's a lot of kind of rules that vary and sometimes don't complement one another within the same metro area that create confusion for tenants too.
Yeah, it's a kind of a confusion, but it's kind of very interesting to look at. So since actually, as you mentioned, just now you mentioned all different regions like Chicago or Philadelphia or Charlotte, and also you need like DC or other regions. So I wonder, since you mentioned how actually the divergence between the principle and the local implementations, so how you see actually for different locations, because you already have the whole country's data, so how you see actually the variation for these different regions for these divergence issue? So is any places they did better than others, or what's the reasons behind that, something like that?
Well, yeah, in our initial study, we did look at all the housing authorities, and we did, in terms of just that inversion of payment standards, it was much more pronounced in, say, some states like Florida than in, other places like New Jersey or Illinois. And so we saw some variation like that, but in a lot of ways, it really went down almost to the individual public housing authority level. And that gets at sometimes the capacity that public housing authorities have to actually implement their programs. And so even in the same metropolitan area, you might have one housing authority that gets less money per voucher than another housing authority operating in that same metropolitan area. And so they'll set their payment standards a little bit differently because they have a base pool of funding that they're trying to distribute to all of their voucher recipients. And so even across housing authorities within the same metro area, you might see that divergence. And the housing authorities themselves, they're doing a balancing act in some ways between how much funds they have, and how they go about trying to pursue, promoting mobility. And then they also have their existing vouchers that they have to kind of address as well, because under law, they have to hold those households harmless from any impact that the small area fair market rent rule will have on them. So if most of your vouchers are in low rent neighborhoods and they're already above what the small area fair market rent is for that area, you have to still maintain that level of subsidy until that lease comes due. And then the question becomes, if the tenant wants to renew in that property, is it fair to reduce their subsidy, or do you have to kind of maintain it because the landlord is already raising rent because rents are going up everywhere, And because if they lose that subsidy, then they have to come up with the difference, out of their own sources, other sources of income. And so that's the other pressure on housing authorities, where they will still keep the small area fair market rent based payment standard in a low rent area higher, because most of their vouchers are there, and if they don't, then they suddenly are, displacing a number of residents. So
I
yeah.
see. I see. Thank you so much for your great talk, and also very inspirational answers for the questions. So usually we give the big applause to the talk. So for the great talk, and also I think we way out of time. So thank you so much for your time to for
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity. I was glad I was able to finally arrange this. I know we had a little bit of a scheduling thing earlier.
Yes, yes.